Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Kaltoff. I chair the History Department here at Hillsdale College, and it's my delight to welcome you here to the Markle Auditorium for our guest lecture this evening. This, of course, is Constitution Day. It was 228 years ago today that the Constitutional Convention wrapped up its business and they signed the document. They did so without some small, actually fairly large, communication and discussion about this new office of the presidency, the Electoral College being one of the chief innovations of this new office of the executive. And some were scared by it. George Mason said that he suspected he smelled in the executive the fetus of a monarchy. Whether or not over the subsequent centuries the executive has become that I leave for you to judge, but perhaps our speaker this evening will be able to shed some light on that question. As the presidential debate of last night is conditioning the news of today, I'm sure he will have some things to say. Victor Davis Hanson is the Martin and Illie Anderson Senior Fellow in Residence in Classics and Military History at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He is a Professor Emeritus of Classics at Cal State University, Fresno, and a nationally syndicated columnist for the Tribune Media Services. And happily, he is also the Wayne and Marcia Buske Distinguished Fellow in History here at Hillsdale College, where for some 12 years now, every fall he comes and teaches a course in the fall semester. He's in the middle of teaching a course on leadership, ancient and modern now, and that will wrap up next week. Dr. Hanson earned his BA in Classics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He studied at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens and earned his PhD in Classical Studies at Stanford University. He's the author of hundreds of articles, book reviews, and scholarly papers that range on topics from ancient Greek, agrarian, and military history to foreign affairs, domestic politics, and contemporary culture. He has also written or edited no fewer than 22 books, including The Other Greeks, The Family Farm and the Agrarian Roots of Western Civilization, The Soul of Battle, Who Killed Homer, The Demise of Classical Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom, Mexiphonia, A State of Becoming, and many others. He has, of course, written widely for the National Review, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and many others, as he has appeared on National Public Radio, PBS NewsHour, Fox News, CNN, and many others. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, who tonight will speak on the topic, Reflections on the GOP Presidential Debates and Prospects for the 2016 Election. Victor.
Thank you very much, Mark. This is my 12th year that I come from California, and it's besides the radical change in climate, because it has rained, I think, 3 inches this year in California, which is less than it has since I've been here, and this is a dry year for you guys. Mark's been my sort of contact here at Hillsdale, so we've developed a habit. What do you do? I call him in May or June and get the classes worked out, the lectures. I was going to talk on World War II, and when I got here, he came up with the idea of the debate. And I thought I would speak for about 25 or 30 minutes and have an open house, because usually when you talk about these candidates, it gets pretty intense, and it's fun, as you saw in some of the give and take. And I promise that I won't say tremendous. I'll make your head spin. Absolutely wonderful, awesome, like some of the candidates. You know, this whole debate is framed on the record, whether we're explicitly or implicitly, of Barack Obama. And it's going to be a great challenge for the next president of either party how to deal with it. If you look at the Middle East, the president said that Yemen was a model of anti-terrorism policy, and then it collapsed 3 weeks after he said that. And in Libya, we were told that leading from behind was a model, and then Hillary said, we came, we saw, he died, and chuckled about the execution of Gaddafi, and then the whole country turned into Mogadishu on the Mediterranean. And then whatever one felt about the Iraq war, by the time Obama entered office, the average monthly death toll in Iraq was less than the accident rate of the U.S. military. And getting out of Iraq in 2011 for an election talking point would have been as if Eisenhower was up for re-election in 1956 and he just pulled everybody out of Korea and said the thing's been over for 4 years, they don't need us. And you can imagine what that would have entailed. You wouldn't have Kia today, you'd have something like North Korea all the way down to Busan. And so the Middle East, and I don't even need to mention ISIS, that we were told was a JV organization. Assad was a reformer. He had a red line he wasn't supposed to cross, a game-changing red line that he did. All of the assurances we were given about the Iran deal, that there would be anytime, anywhere inspections, there would be no centrifuges whatsoever, there would be no enriched uranium whatsoever, there would be all protocols, side agreements via the UN would be shown to the Congress, have proved to be null and void. If you look at the economy, the Federal Reserve today said they're not going to increase interest rates. That's the longest period we've had, essentially, if you calibrate inflation, zero inflation rate. And that's really taken a toll on people who, some of you may have 20, 30, middle-class people like all of us. If you have 40, 50,000 in the bank, you're essentially losing money every month on it, and you have a choice between either playing in the stock market. If you look at your 401k lately, everything's been eaten away since January 1st, that if it did gain, and then or play in the real estate market, because you're going to lose money by being sober and judicious, thrifty, and exemplary, and putting away money and putting it in a passbook account. The economy's not in a great position. We have the highest number of people who are not looking for a job. 91 million Americans have dropped out of the labor force. What I'm most worried about is not just the economy and not just foreign policy, and it came up a little bit, but not nearly enough in the debate, is the attitude toward the law. I don't think that we're like Venezuela or the Congo or maybe revolutionary France in the 18th century. A law that has been passed by Congress and signed into effect by the President no longer matters. I'll give you a couple examples. What would you think if a Republican president came in and treated the IRS the way Lois Lerner did? If we had a high-ranking bureaucrat who went after all the left-wing nonprofits and then pled the fifth, and she still escaped from consequences of the law? Or what if a president decided that the EPA, all of those regulations, were going to have as much statutory effect as ICE does? Just as there's no longer an immigration law enforced, we won't enforce the EPA. The idea that over 300 cities in the United States would adopt the Confederate 1859 idea of nullification, that they were exempt from federal law with sanctuary cities. Could you imagine if Hillsdale said to the next president, well, we decided that the Endangered Species Act doesn't apply within the confines of Hillsdale, and we're going to let you kill a newt or a woodpecker, it just doesn't apply. We're exempt from enforcement of federal law. There'd be outrage. Or if the next president said, you know what, Barack Obama decided to pick and choose which elements of Obamacare, and I don't really want to take the trouble to have it repealed through Congress, so I'm just going to announce certain things that I don't like null and void. We could go on, but you see where we're going. It's a very scary time where the force of the law, or the sanctity of the law, depends on whether it's synonymous with a perception of revolutionary justice or social justice. And if it isn't, then it's not to be enforced. So it's a very strange time. And this election, remember, it's until Joe Biden jumps into this election, it's what we call an orphaned election. There is not an incumbent president or vice president in the race. We hadn't had one, until 2008, since 1952. And usually when you have one, it favors the out party. In other words, when Harry Truman did not run for what would have been de facto a third term, officially a second, but it would put him in office 11, it turned out that Eisenhower and Stevenson both ran against him, and that benefited Eisenhower. When nobody ran in 2008, Dick Cheney couldn't run or didn't want to, and Bush was at the end of his term, then McCain ended up running as much against Bush as had Obama. That favored Obama. because you don't want your guy to trash your guy. You might as well vote for the other person. If this is an orphaned election, you can see that Hillary Clinton will be, and she's already done it, she's already announced that the middle class is shrinking, they hadn't had a fair deal, the Middle East isn't what it should be, and even Biden, before he's a candidate, has mentioned that. So that's going to be something to watch, but I have a feeling that the Democratic candidate will be as critical of the incumbent as McCain was of Bush, and that's not good for the Democratic prospect, and it's a rare phenomenon in American history, orphaned elections. A couple of other things I think are important. We don't know what the key issues are. I just mentioned the Obama record because I feel that the law, or the sanctity of the law, and you feel that, and the economy, the stagnant economy, and the disaster in the Middle East. You woke up one day and Israel was not just not an ally, maybe not a neutral, but the President of the United States has more invective against Netanyahu than he does Khamenei in Iran. It's almost as if it's an enemy now. It's an alternate universe. It's flipped right before our eyes. And these are issues, but it doesn't mean necessarily they're going to be the issues. We don't know what they're going to be in the autumn. In 2008, Obama crafted a campaign based on Iraq. That it was a stupid war, and he was attacking Hillary Clinton all through the primary on her vote for it. And then, meanwhile, insidiously, incrementally, David Petraeus' surge was working. And so we got to June of 2008, and that month nobody was killed in Iraq. And suddenly, Obama erased his website with all references of that we should bring everybody home from March 2008, and the issue, as soon as Hillary lost the nomination, was dead. We didn't know what the issue was. We forget, but I confirmed today, because I couldn't believe it, that on September 13th, for the third consecutive week, John McCain and Sarah Palin were ahead of Barack Obama. That was very late in the campaign, and they were making enormous inroads on the fact that Obama's Iraq ideas were bankrupt. He had said bad things about the surge had worked, he had no experience, and if you look at the various polls, it's anywhere from 2.5% to 5%, and it was pretty steady for 3 weeks. On September 14th, there was a new issue that nobody anticipated. Goldman Sachs imploded. And for the next week, Wall Street firm after Wall Street firm looked like it was going to be bankrupt. Ford Motor Company went down to $2 a share. And suddenly, there had to be a reaction toward that, and the exegesis that John McCain should have said, that this was because of subprime loans that were guaranteed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that's a long, complicated explanation. And when Obama just said, Bush did it, and Bush did it, and McCain's part of it, and then McCain panicked and said, we should suspend the debates, or I'll suspend my campaign for a week. Do you remember that? And within 48 hours, that 4-point lead dissipated to 1 point. Within 72 hours, they were equal, and within 4 to 5 days, Obama was ahead by 3, and within 2 weeks, he was ahead by 7, and he never relinquished that lead. That's an example of an issue that may come up in September. We don't know right now what North Korea is going to be doing. We have no idea if all this crazy talk might become serious at some day, God forbid, in October. We don't know what the Iranians will do. We don't know what Vladimir Putin will do. He could go into Estonia on September 1st. We have no idea what ISIS might do here at home. Another 9/11, we don't know what the economy will be like. There will be an issue, in other words, that will be of fundamental importance that we probably don't even know what it is, and it will change the election. A couple of other things before we look at the candidates. This campaign has very strange demographics. You heard after Romney followed McCain that old white guys in the Republican Party were not the future of America. We heard that again and again and again, and we were told that Ronald Reagan won because the electorate in 1980 was 85% so-called white. Now, forget for a minute that I don't know what white means anymore. In my family, we have 2 people married to Mexican Americans, we have Asians. It's just like everybody's family, especially in California. But if you were to accept that left-wing version that we all have DNA badges that make us a particular race based on the percentage it still is a very strange argument, because what's happened is Obama came in 2008 with a community organizing principle. I'm going to slice the electorate by gender. Life of Julia, remember that little tape he did? He did that in 2012. Sandra Fluke, the urbanized, young, emancipated woman versus the drabby, married woman with 4 kids out in the Michigan countryside, on the idea there were more young women that, of the former than the latter. And then he diced us by gay and straight. He said twice that he believed in the sanctity of traditional marriage, and then when it came time, that was no longer operative. But the big divide was, he looked at the demography and he said, you know what, there's 15% fewer white people, and all of a sudden in 2008, we heard Reverend Wright that he could no more disown Reverend Wright than his own mother. His own grandmother was called typical white person. The clingers in Pennsylvania, get in their face, I'll bring a gun to a knife fight. And then as the presidency, there was the Skip Gates, the Trayvon Martin son that he never had. The Latinos were supposed to punish our enemies, I'm quoting directly. And then there was the disparagement of Romney. It was all predicated that he no longer, as a traditional Democrat, needed to worry so much about the white vote as long as it was 42 to 43%. And it would never go back down to the percentages of Reagan. I think the lowest the Democrats ever got was 35% of a very large white vote in 1984, when there was the wipeout of Walter Mondale. But what Obama did not count on, and the Democratic Party is very worried, is the level of rhetorical attacks on quote-unquote old white men, white privilege, the necessary attacks to get phenomenal participation by so-called minorities. I mean, there was a 66% registration rate of blacks. 96% of blacks voted for Barack Obama. Asians voted, who were sort of split before, at 71%. Hispanics were 72%. And it looked like that theory was, I'm not talking about the morality, the ethics, I'm just looking at the efficacy. It looked like it was a winning strategy, but it was predicated on 2 things. One, that minority allegiance in such unusual and historical numbers was absolutely transferable to somebody other than Obama. If you look at the Democratic field, it's exactly what they used to criticize the Republicans for, because if you take away Hillary, an old white woman, you have an old white Joe Biden, and you have a really old white socialist Bernie Sanders, and then you got a kind of white middle-aged guy named O'Malley and a kind of white old guy named Webb, and then you got 3 old white guys called Jerry Brown, Al Gore, and John Kerry in waiting if they need them. And it's not what they said. If you look at the Republican, all of a sudden you have Bobby Jindal, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Ben Carson, Carly Fiorina. So it suggests that that might not be true, that when Obama's not on the ticket, all of that rhetorical demagoguing might not transfer the same levels. And there's no margin of error now, because if you look at the polls, he's done what nobody thought would be possible. He's got the white vote below 40%, down to Reagan levels almost for the Democrats. If the white vote should get down from, I think it was 39% in the last election, which he won by 3%, if it goes down to 36%, and I think it might well, then it won't matter how much participation. Even Obama would not win at that rate, but surely not one of his successors. So that's something to watch, and what we will expect to see in the election is we will try to see Hillary and Bernie Sanders with the Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot, all of that stuff about immigration, and I stand with you on the border. And then suddenly and magically, when the primaries are over, if it's Hillary, she will be in the Annie Oakley mood again about Boilermakers and shooting and bowling again. And I don't think it's going to work. I really don't. A couple of other things about the debate, and especially Trump. Debates, I know I was exhausted by 3 hours. The debate format's not working in the sense that you had the JV debate to use Obama's terms about JVs, in earlier 2 hours, but you gave more percentage airtime to the second tier 4 than you did to the top 11. And here's a situation where I agree with Donald Trump that 3 hours is too long. You heard everything you needed in the first 2 hours. That said, if you have a good field, then the debates are energizing in the sense that this was the highest rated CNN newscast they'd ever had in the debate forum. And Fox had been the highest that Fox has ever had. Both were higher than any other debate format except the general election. It was a record, partly because of, obviously because of Donald Trump's presence. But the point I'm making is if you have good candidates, and the Republicans do have good candidates, then it makes sense to have a debate every month. If you don't, and I think a good example would be 2012 when you had Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and John Huntsman and Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, then 20 of them have a depressing effect. And people saw how mediocre the Republican field was. This time they're getting a monthly dose of how good it is. And by the same token, just 6 Democratic debates is going to hurt them. So the number of the debates, I think this time was the right number, and the candidate field was much better. And then before we look at each of the candidates, and I do want to have time for question and answer, there's this phenomenon called Trump. You know, he's kind of like Haagen-Dazs ice cream, isn't he? That it tastes good, you feel good, it's sweet, and you know that if you were to continue it, it's not sustainable or good for your health. And you can't keep doing it. But in the meantime, every dark thought you might have had it come across your mind, but you wouldn't dare say, he says for you. So he's a presence. And before we laugh him off, if any of us were given The Apprentice and said, it's your TV show, none of us could make it last for 11 years. That's very hard to make a reality TV show do that. So he's a showman, and I know that he has these eponymous buildings everywhere, and I made this many billion, and it's awesome, and it's tremendous, and I'll do. But the fact is, in today's cutthroat business world, I don't think he's worth 10. I don't think he's worth 8. I believe sober assessments he's worth 4. But to have $4 billion in net worth, even if you inherited $1 billion, in a world that really you don't make money unless you're in finance, insurance, hedge funds, and he's actually building something, suggests to me that he does have talent, a lot of talent. And so it's very intricate how to deal with him if you're a Republican, because on that stage last night, everybody in their dark mind knew that if Trump had not been there, half the people would not be watching them, and yet they knew that if they were to attack Trump, he would attack and retaliate with much more vigor. And Trump's very brilliant how he's run this campaign. He looks for fissures in the seams of the other candidates, and then he exploits them. He's never once attacked a candidate first. He waits till a candidate just makes an offhand slight remark like John McCain did, or Megyn Kelly, or anybody, and then he goes after it. And he picks his victims, at least until Carly Fiorina, very carefully. Now, I thought what he said about John McCain was outrageous. But then I thought, I was driving with a person, and they said, he's done. I said, no, he's not done. And the reason is that, again, all of you in your deep, dark thoughts, you would never voice that, but you got a little tired of him waving the bloody shirt. And as gross and callous as that was, he got away with it. And Megyn Kelly, I thought, was really buffoonish and uncalled for and crude what he said about Megyn Kelly, but deep down inside you thought, you know, the Fox blonde bombshell is getting a little old. That I'm not supposed to say that, but I really don't believe they're legal scholars and PhDs and brilliant with short dresses and fake tans and blonde hair. So when he implies one is a bimbo, we like to watch gladiators in the arena fight it out. And that's what he did. I think he kind of crossed the line with Fiorina, and now he's in a matrix or a paradox of his own creation, and that is he doesn't want to prep like Carly Fiorina, so he doesn't know the issues. I think whether you're for him or against him, you agree with that. And he has a particular style of bombast and invective, and he says politically incorrect things. He's wonderful at that. He gets people energized, but he's got to do that for for 12 debates, and if he doesn't transform that energy into an advancement of a particular agenda or issues in some detail, it's going to get old. Or if other candidates, as happened last night, have the issues and they're starting to peel off his emotions and act more like Trump than Trump is like them. In other words, it seems to me that Christie and Fiorina and Rubio and all of them are acting more like Trump, his style, his energy level, and he's acting less like their strengths, their knowledge of the issues. So he's going to have to do a couple of things, and that is either master the issues while keeping up the energy level, or he's going to have to keep doing what he's doing. And you can see by 3 hours of it, he got tired of it. And then he was nice, and at the end he was gentlemanly, he was funny, he did a high five, he took all the attacks, and he was deflated. And when he walked off the last hour, after dominating the first 2 hours, he'd become a different Trump, a normal, nice guy, and he'd lost the attraction because he's created his own caricature of himself. He's going to have to continue or become a serious candidate, and if he doesn't do the necessary homework, then his strengths are going to be nullified. I'd like to go over the Democratic group first. I made fun of them as old white guys, and they basically are. I think Joe Biden may get in, but he does. I mean, it's very funny about him. We don't associate a 72-year-old white guy as part of the establishment for 40 years, which he is. And he has a unique ability. He's a twice plagiarist. He plagiarized in college and was punished for it, and he plagiarized on his first campaign for presidency and dropped out. And he made it quaint. Plagiarism is just old Joe. And he said some very callous, racial, stupid things about the disabled and people, and he's just old Joe. And he's habitually wrong about politics, whether it's, he said that Iraq would be the administration's greatest achievement, et cetera, and he's wrong, but it doesn't, for all of his aggravating style, he has an endearing quality that has protected him, a Teflon nature. So if he were to run, and just the mention of him has already propelled him from 3 to 20%. He's almost even in the national polls with Bernie Sanders. So I think that there's something about him that I don't think it will win him the national election, but when we think of all the stupid things he said, I mean, he actually said George Bush should get on TV and address the nation after the financial collapse in the same way that FDR in 1929 got on the television, when FDR was not present and there was no TVs. So, and we forgave him. That's just Joe. If George Bush had said that, he would be considered a moron. They're talking about Jerry Brown. Have you heard that? I know a lot about him. I had this sort of habit anytime I wrote on California, which is quite often, about every 8 weeks I get a phone call from this very strange voice, would have a barrage of invectives. You did this and you don't know anything, and it was Jerry Brown. And it sounded more and more shrill, and you almost think that if he actually comes out here at the age of 76, it's almost as if he comes out of a time warp, out of cryogenics or something, and says, I will pledge to protect the earth, serve the people, and explore space. You kids are too young, but that's what he did in 1992. It was very funny. And he hasn't changed at all. It's almost like he's in a time warp. And don't think that he's not seriously considering it. I don't know who Lincoln Chafee is. You hear the name Chafee. Who's Lincoln Chafee? I mean, I guess to answer that question, we have to ask why George Pataki is running. Is it for Secretary of Commerce or something? I don't know. Does anybody think that Al Gore would actually dare do it? The last time we heard of Al Gore, he sold his cable station that was failing for $50 million after acquiring a net worth of $500 million on the idea the planet was heating up and suffocating from carbon. He sold this bankrupt cable company to Al Jazeera, an anti-Semitic state megaphone from Qatar, whose income that went into the Al Gore coffers came from oil products. And he did so to rush the sale to beat the new capital gains tax. So here's a big government, high tax guy trying to beat capital gains tax and selling to a person according to his own philosophy, pollutes the earth, and is quite anti-American if you've ever watched Al Jazeera. So I don't think that's serious. John Kerry, we've heard of. Have you noticed one thing about these candidates is that not only are they old and they're white and they're male, they've all lost. They've all run before. We always said we don't want retreads. Jerry Brown ran for president, he lost. Joe Biden ran for president, he never made it. John Kerry ran for president, he lost. Al Gore won the popular vote, but he lost. So why are we? And Hillary Clinton ran for president, he lost. They have, except for Jerry Brown, they have no geographical diversity. They have no gender except for Hillary. They're all from that eastern seaboard, and they're all that fossilized, ossified, calcified Democratic Party that had been in politics for years. And I think Kerry's motto would be, you know, after this Iran deal falls apart, I was for the Iran deal before I'm against it, because I know that's coming. He's going to say that. Bernie Sanders is a tired socialist insider, and he's running as a fresh populist outsider. And I don't think that's going to work. He's a very endearing guy. He really believes that socialism is the answer, but most people realize that for all the glitz about Barack Obama, he came in with supermajorities in the House and a big majority in the Senate, and nobody in the last 50 years has done more damage to this and destroyed the Democratic Party like Barack Obama. He lost the House, he lost the Senate, he's lost 2/3 of the state legislatures, he's lost 62% of the governorships. And I think if you look at these paradigms between, you know, Salt Lake City or Houston versus Detroit and Chicago, or California versus Nevada or Florida, people see these contrasts, or the EU versus what used to be the United States. They don't think that that paradigm of statism or socialism is very convincing. Hillary, I'll finish with her. You all remember Oscar Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray? We all thought that was Bill Clinton. The sins of his life were starting to appear in his wrinkles. But it actually, if you see her, it's actually Hillary Clinton. It's almost as if the more things she's done, she has a psychological tick. Have you noticed that? That she'll mention something, and then you'll say, yes, that's right, you did that. And she'll say, we need, the other night she said, we need transparency. And I thought, yes, you're not transparent with your emails. And then she said, and hedge funds make more than kindergarten teachers. And I said, yes, they do. And Chelsea made $15 million in hedge funds. And you rented an office in a hedge fund office building as soon as you came out of office. And your son-in-law is worth $20 million out of hedge funds. And when she says these things, you just, you know, I don't want to get into that, but I'm trying to be funny tonight. And she said just the other day, I watched a video, did you see it, about sexual assault? She said, you can be believed. You don't have to apologize. You can make them take, I thought, wow, Juanita Broderick, Paula Jones, Monica Lewinsky, what was the whole paradigm of the Clinton machine? It was that these women were trailer trash. You put out a $10 bill, they came out of their trailers, they had been falsely accused, poor bill. So it's really kind of a caricature that almost everything she said is a referendum on her past life. The last one I really liked is when she said, student loans are too high, and students are got $1 trillion in debt, and it's because the universities are spending too much money. She went down to UCLA and charged UCLA for 30 minutes, $10,000 a minute for a hackneyed 28-minute lecture about her life. I mean, who could think of how many students could have, you know, gone to school? You could have had 10 students' tuition paid for that 30-minute harangue. So she's got a real problem. And if you compare her, the other candidate I haven't mentioned is Elizabeth Warren, but don't you believe that Elizabeth Warren looks 20 years younger than Hillary, even though she sounds 30 years older because she's a granny scold, but she's actually just a year and a half younger. And it's phenomenal that, as I said, Hillary's becoming Dorian Gray. Getting to the, you saw all the Republican candidates last night. I don't know what it is about Jeb Bush. I do some of these radio shows, Mark Levin and Laura Ingraham, and if I've had a little bit to drink, even Michael Savage once in a while, and on tape first. But you talk to these guys during the break, and they have a pathological hatred of Jeb Bush. It's not, I understand the frustration of the the Republican establishment is John Boehner and Mitch McConnell, kind of like blue-stocking Republican characters of the 1950s. But it's really strange that if they were to nominate Jeb Bush, the greatest anger would come from Republicans. And yet, watching him last night, you get the feeling that he really did have the more he tells us the details of his conservative record in Florida, and the more conservative that he asserts that he is, the less natural he seems to be a conservative. How does he do that? I don't know, but he's done it. And he's a very nice guy, and he's a very conservative guy, but the more he explains why, we don't believe that he's conservative. I don't know what to say about Ben Carson, only that we have not had an outlier, a non-professional, since Dwight D. Eisenhower, also in the 52 orphaned election. So maybe that 64-year tradition is valuable rather than is in need of change, because it's going to be very hard for Fiorina and Trump and Carson, not that they can't do it, but I don't think any of them have the accomplishments of leading the D-Day invasion of Europe. And that's going to be hard. Part of the problem with a candidate like Carson, he's very talented, but you don't want everybody to be rooting for him silently and say, if he just speak up a little louder. And that's what our reactions are, that he's so reflective and contemplative. And then he also, on the issues, he has the first 75% right. And you want him to stop and don't go into a detailed analysis of foreign policy, because it's going to end up loony. When he talks about immigration, you say, just stop. Don't get into the Becerra program of the 1950s. Does he ever have any idea that we had this song called Deportee or CBS, Harvest of Shame? I grew up with the Becerros. When he talks about guest workers and agriculture, you're getting into that whole 50s, 60s reform movement that's not wise. I don't know what Lindsey Graham's point is. He has a point for the candidacy. Does anybody know what it is? I don't know why he's running. Is it to a neocon? I don't know what it is, but maybe you do. I wrote a little thing down for Huckabee. I kind of like Huckabee. And I wrote, would that his noble creed be inductively inferred rather than deductively applied. And by that I meant I'd like to know that he was a Christian by his positions on the issues after he gave them. I could surmise that he's very Christian-like, rather than be told in advance that he was a Christian and then that Christianity fit all the issues or made them fit. And so whether he's a very good speaker, and he's very quick on his feet, as we knew from his show, but he's got this idea that everything is going to be seen in this particular religious prism, and then he applies that to the issues rather than just not mention it. And you, after 3 hours, you would say, God, based on what he said on the issue, that guy's very Christian-like. But you wouldn't want to be told that deductively in advance. Carly Fiorina, I just watched TV before I came here. She's exploding. Everybody says, but I looked at the polls today before the debate, and she was at 3%. I come from California, where Barbara Boxer wiped her out by a 10% lead, but she ran a good campaign. She did better than Meg Whitman did against Jerry Brown. And then I work in a city where most of I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the donors who we have to work with at the Hoover Institution were associated with or knew members of Hewlett-Packard when she was CEO. And I think that'll come out. She's not a popular person in Silicon Valley. I think maybe unjustifiably so. But my question, and maybe you can, in the question answer that, is, to me, of all the candidates last night, she seemed the wittiest. She seemed the most informed. She seemed the most knowledgeable. She seemed the boldest. She seemed to have the most appropriate response to Donald Trump. And then I said, dash in my head, and now what? Now what? So she gets out in that debate. Does she just keep doing this each debate, or does she transform herself into a Trump on the campaign, and she's got big spectacles, and she gets people all excited, and she takes on people? I don't know. But I do know that of all the debaters, she's the best debater, but I don't know if that translates into raising a lot of money yet and conducting a very brilliant campaign on the stump as the anti-Hillary. I'm just going to finish with the minor candidate. Bobby Jindal, you know what? Never in the history, I'm quoting Churchill now, and Larry Arnn, if he was here, would like this. Never have you been able to learn so much from so quickly from just one person and regret the experience of going through that. And I don't know what it is about him, but every time I listen to him, he knows almost everything. And he's able to tell you that in about 30 seconds. In such a way that it's mind-numbing, and you go away exhausted and depressed. So I don't think that he's going to make it. Same thing about Kasich. I'm really impressed, I think you are, with his soberness and judiciousness. Every issue he takes the high road. I would just like to read about it rather than actually hear him, because he sounds like an uncle that scolds you all the time. I had an uncle like that on the farm, and he would come in and he'd say, "Now, Victor, let me show you how to put a PTO shaft onto the machine." And then the next thing I knew, he was giving me a lecture about everything, about my dress, my attitude, my language, and he was scolding me. And that's the way Kasich comes across, I think. And yet, the election will be won, as you know. There's only about 8 states that are purple states now. And we can talk all we want about Texas being a red state, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much the minority Latinos vote against the Republican. They're not going to win Texas. By the same token, you could go out to California 100 times if you're Carly Fiorina and be a native daughter, and you're not going to win California. You're going to, the election is going to be decided in Florida, Ohio, Colorado, New Mexico, maybe places like Oregon, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And you're going to need a candidate. So in theory, everybody said Kasich, Walker, Rubio. That gives you the states. And that was part of the attraction for Kasich. Rand Paul, Rand Paul has a quirky sense of intelligence. He is very smart. It's quirky, though, and he has a quirkier way of talking. Have you noticed that? And he's one quirk away each minute he talks from being creepy and scary. And you don't know when that quirk's going to happen. And that's my view of him. I mean, when he mentions the Middle East, his eyes get big, and I thought, or he mentions the police have too much machinery and body armor, and I think, that's it. Be quiet. He's kind of scary, if not creepy. Rubio. Everybody likes Rubio. I do. He's the best argument that experience doesn't matter, isn't it? If he gets nominated, we can make the argument that, as the Democrats did with Obama, that you don't need experience. He's got every other requisite. He's a great speaker. He's brilliant, but he doesn't have an executive experience, and he's not. And you saw that, I think, when he got leverage in the immigration debate by Schumer. I like Rick Santorum. Every time I see him talk, don't you think if it was just true that we could go back to the 1950s, if he could be president and hit a button and say we're back in 1958, I'd vote for him. But he can't. And we're never going to be able to go back to his world. I wish we could. But every time I see him, he keeps talking about all these things I grew up with, and I thought, you know what, it's dead. And all of your effort and all, we're not going to bring it back, whether we like it or not. I mentioned Trump. He's like Haagen-Dazs, or as I said, a martini. It tastes good, it's fun, but it's going to kill you if you keep at it. And I'll finish with Scott Walker, somebody that you guys know a lot better than I do. I'll just say a brief sentence about him. Every time I hear him, I'm in California, and I realize why I like the sheriff in the movie Fargo. He sounds like her, he's sensible, he's honest, and yet I don't think he's going to inspire people yet. So let me conclude, and we'll have some questions. What are we looking at? The odds are probably that Hillary will be nominated. With all of this, we keep saying her polls are diving, and even pundits that are as skilled as Nate Silver, mathematicians, statisticians, have charted her all the way down, but she's still 20 points ahead of Bernie Sanders. And the question's not, is Hillary going to be nominated, but there's no Barack Obama this year. So she has no competition. So the odds are likely that she will be nominated. Her fate depends entirely on how Valerie Jarrett gets up every morning and feels in the White House. Because if she sees something that she doesn't like, and there's a lot not to like about Hillary, especially as she begins to triangulate against Barack Obama, then she can get on the phone and have the Justice Department leak more information that they have. The more that is leaked, then it's like a forest fire that leaps up again with the emails. The email thing will not be solved because she can't tell the truth, because to tell the truth would reveal things that she did was not only illegal but unethical. And we look at Petraeus, we look at people in the intelligence community that we know that would be behind bars, so that her candidate, as a candidate, she's viable to the degree that we can just settle this thing down, the media cooperates, and that depends on the Obama administration not trying to become nihilistic. If Biden gets in the race, who knows what they would do. So I think she will be the nominee, and I think all of us on the conservative side want a ticket with a couple of things. They want a candidate or two, better two, from these key states. They want people, this is why Trump is so popular. They want somebody who does not play by the Marcus of Queensberry rules. They are so sick of John McCain saying, I'm not going to mention Reverend Wright. Why not? They do it against you. They ran a commercial against you that showed you that you didn't remember that you had 11 houses. And Mitt Romney said, you know, we want to run this campaign a certain way. And I think 30 seconds after he said that, they had a commercial of a African-American sanitation worker saying, I pick up his garbage in San Diego, and he never comes out and has coffee with me. The next commercial showed him with a dog pin on a cartoon of a dog thing on his car. When they got through with him, they turned a very nice, gifted person into an absolute, greedy, old white monster. And he kept saying, we're not. When Candy Crawley hijacked that debate and abandoned her role as a disinterested moderator and became a partisan, you thought that he was going to grab the microphone and said, how dare you? And he didn't do it. I think they need somebody like the old Lee Atwater who turned, I mean, in a very cruel way, but when he got done with Michael Dukakis, George H.W. Bush looked like Ronald Reagan. And you're going to have to either give up on the presidency or you're going to have to play that type of deterrent politics. So you need somebody that has Trump's attitude but is informed. And I think right now it seems to me that that Rubio and Christie and maybe Walker and Cruz and Fiorina count in that sense. You need somebody that really knows the issues. They all do. You need somebody that has experience. I tend to, and I think you do too, would prefer somebody maybe with some executive experience. In theory, the best ticket so far seems to be Fiorina and Rubio, maybe Rubio at the top, only because as I said, we don't want somebody, we haven't had somebody since Eisenhower with no political experience. So, and what is the election going to turn on? It's going to turn on an issue that we don't know yet. And getting back to this calculus I touched on, it's going to be how well the Democrats are going to be able to say the Republicans represent white privilege, a dominant white male, 70% of the country that time has passed by, and how well that will energize minorities to vote for somebody who is not Barack Obama in the ticket, and how many people who are so-called Reagan Democrats, conservative working class, mostly whites, get sick of it and say enough is enough and I'm going to vote for a Republican. And if that latter number is over 65%, then it doesn't really matter how many people or voter fraud. It won't matter. The Democrats will lose, and if it's not, they'll win. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we have a student with a microphone. Since this event is being streamed on the internet, we'd like to be able to get the question before the answer. So put your hand up, and she will come by you, and Victor will answer from here so his voice can be heard as well. I would also note that in the lobby afterwards, there's going to be a small reception. Folks are welcome to stay and continue the conversation with Dr. Hanson for a little while, but we do have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions right now. Let me use this.
Answer question. Fred Smith, Competitive Enterprise Institute. The debate I found very frustrating. 3 hours, a long time, but virtually nothing other than a few macroeconomic problems, big debts and so forth, but nothing about the regulatory state, nothing about how we're going to disentangle this labyrinth of any entrepreneurial things. And at the military side, a lot of discussion of the military foreign policy side, but there was no real attempt to say how much can we afford. Are there any boundaries from America doing everything around the world? It was sort of, we care, we can do it all. It sounded to me as very shallow on both the economic and the foreign policy side.
I agree with you, and that was no more evident when they talked about Social Security, and Trump suggested that people in his income bracket not take it. That will have no effect on something. I turned 62 last week, and I looked at how much I'm going to get for Social Security, and then I look at what my children are making and what they take out, and I say to myself, that's not sustainable. And the only answer is that people in our age group are going to have to privately, off the record, recycle our Social Security to our children who are paying it, because otherwise it's not sustainable. And the budget, as I said, it's going to be $20 trillion, and why the Federal Reserve did not raise it. We can't even raise the interest rates up to 1%, because to do so, the service on the debt would be, I mean, if you get up to 5%, we're going to be losing $500 to $600 billion for debt service. And then think about it. Barack Obama has exhausted the arsenal. Usually when you want to solve a slow economy, you do two or three things. You get interest rates to nothing or low, and then you have big deficits, and then the economy kicks in and creates revenue and you get back again. But we've already done that. We've shot all those arrows in our quiver. The zero interest rate has not helped the economy that much, and he says he's a success because we have the largest number of dollars coming in, greatest number of revenue we've ever had this last quarter because of the in-tax rate up to 39.5. Back way above Reagan levels, back to Bill Clinton's levels on top income. And we got the deficit down to from 1.4 trillion, 3 trillion down to 500 billion, and we called that success. And it's not sustainable. And yet in the military, you're right about the candidates. We're going to be down to 3% GDP, and we're going to have a smaller fleet in the number of ships since World War I, and that's not sustainable unless the strategic responsibility and vision. So those candidates should have said one of three things. I admired Carla Fiorina. She said, we have to get this many ships and battalions. Sounded great, but what she didn't tell us was, and here's how I'm going to pay for it, and if you don't want to pay for it, these are the following countries that we're going to pull back from. So the irony is that everybody's making fun of Trump because he lives in a fantasy world of no facts, and yet the people who advance facts in some ways are just as fantastical. That's a good point.
In last night's debate, one of the candidates, I don't remember who, one of the candidates, I don't recall who, described Iran as being America's greatest existential threat at this point. And almost all the candidates, with the possible exception of Rand Paul, seem to agree and let the conversation go in that direction. Do you agree? And if not, from a foreign policy perspective, where should we be looking?
Well, I think what Rand Paul is saying is that when we had this discussion in the 90s under Bill Clinton, and the same people who negotiated the Iran deal, most of them negotiated the North Korean deal. So Rand Paul, if he were here, and I wouldn't want to misrepresent him, I think he'd say, well, all you alarmists said that if North Korea gets a nuke, and now they have 7 or 8 of them, and they have a missile capability, then we'd be dead. And you know what? They're not, because China will deter them or something. So he would say, even if they get a nuke, people as mainstream as Abizaid said that. I disagree, because I think it's a revolutionary society, Iran is. And we've always been told that Sunni Wahhabi Islamic terrorism is not state. It may be stealthily advanced by Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, but it's not a state, and therefore it doesn't have the capability. Iran is a state, and we know that the Shia brand of radical Islam is a little bit more unstable or messianic, let's say. And Iran has a visceral hatred of us. So when Obama says that by bringing it into the fold of nations and releasing this money that has been impounded and allowing this $30 billion of oil to be sold, they're going to be Chinaized. In other words, the consumer class will moderate I don't see there's any historical evidence for that. People said the same thing about Hitler. Only 5% of the Germans are Nazis. Give them the Rhineland, Austria, and finally nobody in their right mind would go down that road. And they didn't realize that Hitler was not Kaiser Wilhelm, and the Nazis were not Prussian Junkers. And this Iranian theocratic group may do things that are illogical. Obama thinks nobody would be so stupid to cause a nuclear exchange, but that assumes they share his logic and the premises of his logic. If you're one of them and you believe that Israel is a one-bomb state and that 50 million people dying is not that bad because they're all going to go to a better place anyway, and that Iran would survive, and if they did do that, for the next millennium, the mantle of Islamic supremacy would be transferred from the Sunnis to the only country that had the guts, i.e. a Shia theocracy, then it makes some sense. So I'm very worried about it. I don't know if they're subject to the traditional deterrent laws of deterrence.
Dr. Hanson?
Yes.
In addition to that particular issue is also the change that we have in this agreement in terms of if Israel attacks Iran and our position relative to having to defend Iran at that point. I'm not sure any people understand that at this point.
Well, I think you're referring, and I did read the entire treaty. I tried to convince our local congressman, and he and I had an email exchange last week. He's voting for it. And there was an element, I don't know the exact number, and it said that the United States is committed to protecting the sanctity of the protocols, and that would be logically interpreted that we're not going to allow a cyber attack on the centrifuges from Israel, and you could also interpret that as we would discourage Israel from preemptively bombing it because of this protocol. And yet what's ironic about that is our own State Department and our own President said we cannot include or bundle or in parasitical fashion things like Hezbollah or Hamas or terrorism. That's outside the agreement. And yet there's things in that agreement that go way beyond just the question of ballistic missiles. Now the $64,000 question is Obama a naive that doesn't understand what classical rules of warfare have been? He doesn't understand why people go to war and why they fight it and how they lose or win? Or is he more dangerous and he has some unhinged notion that Iran could be a strategic partner of the United States and balance us with the Sunni monarchies? They believe that, and with Israel, and therefore that we could be playing both sides. And if that's true, then I don't have much hope at all. It's going to be very dangerous. I think a couple more questions.
This will be our final question.
Dr. Hanson, do you have any opinion on the probability of there being a pre-election surprise or an October surprise that might entail something like an Obama impeachment, or, having looked up Jade Helm on Google, there's been some talk of martial law taking place, anything like that?
Well, I don't know if it would be that dramatic. Everybody remembers what an October surprise it is. It's an event that an incumbent president has the power to shape or massage in a way that he thinks will enhance his reelection or his successor of the same party's election. And it's an old trick. I'll give you one example. In 1942, we were at war, and we had been at war for about 11 months, and Franklin Roosevelt was very worried about the midterm election for two reasons. One, he had promised that we weren't going to go to war, but then the euphoric anger after, I shouldn't say euphoric, that's an oxymoron, but the anger after Pearl Harbor, we hadn't done anything yet. So we were going to invade North Africa, Operation, I think it was Husky, and we were going to land at Morocco. And he was pushing the whole time, and George Marshall got angry. He said, "You know what? We can't get this landing before that November 11th." I think it was. So we ended up landing 3 or 4 days after the election. But the Roosevelt administration was trying to make the election more important than the strategic safety of our soldiers to go in. And that was a very common thing. All the Republicans accused him of doing that all during the war. And of course, Dwight Eisenhower, when he ran in 1952, he never forgave Matthew Ridgway, who had saved Korea, because he did not want, he saved Korea after the loss of Seoul. He retook it after the invasion of the Chinese across the Yalu River. And then Ridgway took all of South Korea and he saved it. He was back on the 38th parallel. And Eisenhower was running on the idea that he'd bugged out, that if he got back South Korea, why not take the other? And he knew that we weren't going to do that, but he ran and ran and ran. And there was some hint that the Truman administration put pressure, or thought that Ridgway under no circumstances should do anything but sit there and not try to affect the war in a way that would confirm what Eisenhower was advocating. Of course, Eisenhower got elected anyway, and then he didn't do anything different than Truman did. And we had that big controversy with the Reagan administration in 1980. Gary, what's his name? Salksip? He made the argument that the Reagan administration was trying to cut a deal with the Iranians to not release the hostages until after the election, so Carter would look weak, and that was refuted. But on the other hand, there were suggestions that Carter himself was willing to do things that he wouldn't have otherwise done, because if he got the hostages released. And what am I getting at? Every president is accused of this. And I'll give you one last example and shut up. In the 2012 re-election, in mid-September, we had Benghazi, and that refuted the slogan, GM is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead, that Al-Qaeda was no longer existent because of the brilliance of Barack Obama. And so they advanced a narrative. It wasn't Al-Qaeda, it's dead. We didn't have to beef up Benghazi embassy because there's no threat. It was a spontaneous riot created by one of those right-wing video makers, Nakula. So they went out and jailed a guy on a minor probation, put him in jail for a year, and then over the dead bodies, Hillary said it was a riot, we'll get the filmmaker. They knew at the time that was not true, and yet they had needed that election point. And now the controversy that I think it will happen with the Benghazi hearings is, to what degree did they compromise David Petraeus, who made a number of assertions, both under oath in private sessions with the Intelligence Committee, but also publicly, that was a spontaneous riot and the Obama administration was correct. And then as soon as that talking point defused the issue, the campaign issue, was it 4 days after the election, he resigned. And he resigned in scandal that apparently was known in August. And again, the question was, they had compromised a CIA to get the election quiet about Benghazi. And so what I'm getting at is, it wouldn't be unusual in American history if Obama is invested in a particular candidate to try to do a big deal. And he's talked about certain deals that he's interested in. One was the Iran, the Cuba deal. Maybe he could reset with Putin or something. My own theory is that Obama's a narcissist, and he's a nihilistic narcissist, and he's not willing to do anything for anybody unless he knows that that will further his own reputation and legacy. So if Joe Biden were to run and were to be nominated and were to be in a close race, I think that would be very likely that he would look to a foreign policy coup to help Biden, but not with Hillary Clinton. I think it's a legitimate speculation that he would prefer a Republican to win over Hillary. Because I don't think he thinks that she's going to run on his legacy, that he knows her better than we do, and he knows that she's going to run against him and say she's going to bring back the Renaissance of 1992 to 2000 under her husband. Once she gets nominated, she will do that. Thank you.